Hey everybody, it's Nick here at Higher Precision again, and today we're going to be reviewing the Fowler Xtender Bore Gage, part number 52-646-400. Today we're going to be reviewing the Fowler Xtender Bore Gage, part number 52-646-400. The great part about this bore gauge here is it's essentially the two most popular ranges of bore gauges all wrapped into one. For those of you that are familiar with bore gauging, you'll know that a 1.4 to 2 inch and then 2 to 6 inch are by far the most popular range bore gauges. Fowler hit the nail on the head when they came up with the extender sets. It's the two most popular bore gauge ranges all wrapped into one. So let's take a look at this one here. What does it include and what are the specs? This one includes a 5/10 indicator on here. It's going to get you down to a measuring depth of approximately 9.5 inches. And the total range it covers is 1.4 through 6. Now, within the kit, you're going to open it up and let's quickly explain what everything is. You're going to get two different feet for the bore gauge use. The smaller foot here is actually used for the anvils when measuring from 1.4 through 2 inches. And then you have a larger foot here that is used when measuring from 2 to 6 inches. Also included in the kit, you'd have a 2-inch extension, a manual. You have a set of 4 spacers. The dial indicator, shroud, 5/10 graduations on here, and it does have the tolerancing indicators as well. And on top of that, you're going to get all of the carbide tipped anvils to be able to let you measure the whole range of 1.4 through 6 inches. Now, we do get a lot of phone calls when you do sell this set that people call up and they think that they're missing anvils, because it does appear that there are 3 missing anvils here. However, the smaller anvil here, the 2-inch anvil, is actually already preloaded into the 2 to 6 inch foot, and the smaller, the 1.4 inch anvil, is already preloaded into the 1.4 to 2 inch foot. So the only one that is missing, and technically should be missing, in this large anvil here. And the reason is Fowler, they kind of create a universal bore gauge case that they can use for a wide variety of their bore gauges, just so they don't have to create a custom case for every one. So this large anvil should be missing, definitely not included in this bore gauge set. So let's take a little bit deeper dive. I'd like to show a few of you that have any questions on how to actually assemble the bore gauge and how to correctly set it in a setting ring. So now I'm going to take a couple minutes to quickly explain to you folks that are interested on how to actually assemble the extender bore gauge yourself. With that, you are going to need a good jeweler's screwdriver. And to set it up for the purpose of this demo today, we're actually going to be setting up the bore gauge to measure a 1.6 inch setting ring. So for that sake, I know I'm going to need the smaller foot for 1.4 to 2 inches. And if I'm looking at the anvils here, all the anvils are labeled. And there's actually an anvil labeled 1.6 inches, which is exactly what we're trying to set. So I'm actually going to use that anvil in the foot of the bore gauge. So let's start putting this baby together and see how it goes. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the foot that measures from 2 to 6 inches. I'm going to take my time, just quickly remove this here. I'm going to put on the smaller foot. Alright, so I remove that foot, and I'm going to put the smaller foot from 1.4 to 2 inches on here. And once I have that secured on, I'm actually going to remove the smaller anvil and put in the 1.6 anvil that we do have here. Alright, so there's a little knurled knob. You can just unscrew that, pop out the 1.4 inch anvil, put that back in space so I make sure I don't lose it. And I'm going to put in the 1.6 inch anvil. Now, before I actually put on the 1.6 inch anvil, I wanted to quickly explain the purpose of the spacers here, because a lot of people do call up with questions on what to actually do with the spacers. Now, the point of the spacer is, if you need it, it's not always needed, the spacers can go on the back side of the anvil. And what that actually does is the spacer will actually extend the anvil out just a little bit more. So they aren't always needed, but you do get 4 different size spacers in there in case you are going to need them here. Alright, so now we have the smaller foot installed on the bore gauge. Our next step is to actually put the indicator on the bore gauge itself. And this is where you're going to need a small jeweler's screwdriver. There are 2 screws right there. We're just going to quickly remove these 2 screws. And I've been thinking about possibly working on my singing voice or whistling to help get through the quiet times here. Alright, so I'm going to pop that part off. And there's a little plastic cover that actually protects the indicator. We can just remove that there. And now we're going to install the bore gauge into the indicator. Now on the top of the bore gauge you are going to see a black knurled knob. You can just back off on that just a little bit. And we're going to insert this into the bore gauge. Needle's moving, so I know we made good contact there. And once I've installed that there, I'm actually going to tighten the black knurled knob until it's snug. And then I'm just going to put on this black protective cover, tighten the 2 screws, and we should be good to go, ready to start measuring here. Alright, grab my jeweler's screwdriver, and tighten these 2 screws. You don't want to go too tight, and I don't recommend using an electronic screwdriver either. Just get a cheap, inexpensive handheld jeweler's screwdriver. And I think we are good to go with the assembly there. We do have the bore gauge assembled. The indicator is snug. We have the foot from 1.4 to 2 inches in there and the 1.6 inch anvil. And before we start measuring, we just want to make sure that the bore gauge is going correctly. And the way we can do that is, if you look at the foot of the bore gauge, you have 2 centralizing wheels. Now, within the 2 centralizing wheels, there's actually a little pin. And that's actually what does all the measuring on a bore gauge. So quickly, I'm just going to depress that pin to make sure that the gauge is measuring. And I can tell that when I push that pin in and out, the needle's moving. So I know that we have it set up correctly. So now we're going to just quickly switch up the camera views, and I'm going to teach a couple of you on how to actually set this bore gauge in a setting ring. The extender bore gauge has been assembled correctly, and now we actually have to put it in the 1.6 inch setting ring to set the bore gauge prior to use. Now, when we put this in the setting ring, we're going to be doing 2 different things. We're going to be rocking the bore gauge back and forth, specifically looking for the reversal point. But also, when we do rock that bore gauge back and forth, in between the 2 centralizing wheels we just briefly mentioned before is the pin. This is the pin, when depressed, that actually does the measuring. So when you're rocking this bore gauge back and forth, you do want to make sure that that pin is being depressed. So let's put it in the ring and set the bore gauge here. So we're going to put this gauge in the ring and I'm going to start rocking it back and forth. And again, we're going to do 2 things here. We're going to make sure that that pin is being depressed, which it is, because I can tell that the needle's moving. So the next thing we need to be focused on is the reversal point. So we're rocking the bore gauge back and forth in our setting ring to try to find the reversal point. So I kind of keep it at a high point. I'm going to be rocking the bore gauge, and if you watch the needle, it goes one way, one way, one way, one way, one way. It hits a point called the reversal point, and then it starts going back the other way. And if you look, I've already rotated the bezel on the indicator. So right now, this bore gauge is perfectly set up for a 1.6 inch dimension. This bore gauge is also offered with a 1/10 indicator, and as well as an electronic model if you're interested. That wraps up our review on the Fowler Xtender Bore Gage. This bore gauge truly is 2 bore gauges wrapped into one, and it's sold at a great price point. If you do have any other further questions, you can feel free to reach out to us at HigherPrecision.com. And until next time, we'll see you again.